Hey there. Tonight we're stepping into the Middle Ages, a time of crowns, courts, battles, and uneasy rule. This is the story of the most hated kings of the Middle Ages, the rulers who earned reputations for cruelty, misrule, or failure. They were born into power and sometimes held it for decades. In this narration, we will look at the choices they made, the suffering those choices caused, and the long shadows that remained after their reigns. Meanwhile, the aim is not to judge in anger, but to explain calmly how these rulers came to be remembered. If this kind of storytelling helps you rest, feel free to like the video and subscribe, but only if it truly brings you peace. Let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is right now. So dim the lights, let the calm settle in, close your eyes, and let's begin with the tales of the most hated kings of the Middle Ages. This is the story of King John of England, often called John Lackland. He lived at the end of the 12th century and the start of the 13th century. He became one of the most disliked rulers of his time. This account will follow his childhood, his struggles with family and nobles, his wars and losses in France, and the events that led to the Magna Carta of 1215 CE. The aim is to explain what happened in clear, calm sentences, so you can follow the facts and the consequences. John was born in 1166 CE, the youngest surviving son of Henry II and a leaner of Aquitaine. As the youngest, he received little land and few prospects. That is the origin of the name Lackland. His childhood unfolded at a royal court crowded with elder brothers and powerful nobles. Rivalry was part of life there. Three brothers in particular shaped his early years. Henry, the young king, was crowned in his father's lifetime, though he did not rule independently. Geoffrey married into Brittany and held his own ambitions. Richard, later Richard I, rose to fame through warfare and the Crusades. Each brother had claims and duties that left little room for a youngest son to create a stable base of power. John's position as a younger son made him impatient. He sought lands and influence wherever he could find them. For a time, he ruled parts of Ireland, but this did not amount to the inheritance he had hoped for. Meanwhile, tensions with his brothers increased. The period saw rebellions and shifting loyalties. On several occasions, John sided with discontented nobles against his father or his brothers. Those choices shaped his reputation at court. Over time, the family's internal struggles hardened into a record of personal enmities. When Richard first left for the crusade and then for captivity, John moved to fill the gap. He attempted to secure power while Richard was absent. This contributed to a long-standing perception that he was grasping and untrustworthy. Richard first died in 1199 CE. John then claimed the throne and was crowned. The transition was contested. His nephew, Arthur of Brittany, had supporters who believed that Arthur had a stronger claim. A dispute followed. The capture and likely death of Arthur around 1203 CE became a central accusation against John. Many contemporaries and later chroniclers blamed John for Arthur's disappearance. Whether John ordered Arthur's death or whether it occurred through other circumstances, the event deeply damaged John's reputation among the nobility and among those who recorded history at the time. Once king, John faced rivals both within England and across the English possessions in France. Those continental lands had been part of an extended Angevin empire. Over time, they became the focus of conflict with the French king, Philip II. John's rule in France was marked by setbacks and misjudgments. He lost key strongholds and faltering support among local lords. In 1204 CE, Normandy fell to Philip II, a loss that many contemporaries saw as catastrophic. Normandy had been central to the English royal identity since William the Conqueror. Its loss cost John not only territory, but also prestige. That change shifted the balance of power in northern France and left John with smaller holdings across the Channel. John's failures in France had consequences at home. Defeat in the field increased pressure on his finances. Wars are costly, and his military setbacks meant that larger armies and new contracts were needed. He turned to taxation and the imposition of financial levies to fill the royal coffers. At times, he demanded money from his barons in return for favors or the right to inherit lands. He used existing legal mechanisms, including scutage, more frequently than his predecessors. Scutage allowed a knight to pay instead of serving personally in war. John's heavy use of scutage, together with higher fines and payments for royal privileges, created resentment. Many nobles felt that their rights and expectations were being overridden by royal need. The management of justice was another point of tension. John used the royal courts to raise money. He sold offices and manipulated legal procedures, sometimes to collect large fines from those accused of crimes or of failing to meet feudal obligations. He extended the application of the forest laws, which regulated land use and could carry harsh penalties. People who saw their traditional rights curtailed found this practice particularly burdensome. In this way, the legal system became a tool of fiscal extraction. The result was growing anger among barons, bishops, and townsmen alike. Relations with the church also became a serious problem. Disputes over church appointments escalated when the See of Canterbury became vacant. The monks of Canterbury elected Stephen Langton as archbishop, while John refused to accept this choice. The disagreement drew in the Pope, Innocent III. In 1208 CE, Innocent III placed England under an interdict, which suspended many church services. That step affected the whole population. In 1209 CE, John himself was excommunicated. The Pope's actions isolated John from spiritual authority and increased his political difficulties. Facing pressure from both secular and religious figures, John eventually sought a settlement. In 1213 CE, he submitted to the Pope, accepted Stephen Langton, and even agreed to make England a papal fief in exchange for papal support. That submission temporarily restored papal favor, but it did little to repair his strained relationship with the English barons. As tensions rose, John tried to maintain his authority through force and through legal penalties. He could be unpredictable in manner. When nobles failed to meet his demands, he could seize their lands or imprison them. He used hostages and fines to bind loyalty. Some men lost life and property as a result. For many, these policies read as tyranny. Stories of cruelty circulated and were later recorded by chroniclers. His political behavior created an atmosphere of fear and exhaustion among the magnates of the realm. The immediate cause of the baronial rebellion lay in a mix of personal grievances and structural problems. Heavy taxation, arbitrary justice, and military failures had created a coalition of nobles who sought redress. By 1214 CE, John faced open opposition. That year he attempted to recover his position in France, but met with defeat at the battle that confirmed Philip II's control. His ally, Emperor Otto, suffered loss at the Battle of Bouvines in 1214 CE, and that defeat removed hope of reclaiming lost lands. Back in England, baronial discontent hardened into a formal demand for limitations on royal power. In 1215 CE, a group of rebellious barons forced a confrontation at Runnymede by the Thames. There, they presented John with a set of demands. In this moment, he agreed to a document that aimed to limit his authority and to protect certain rights. That document became the Magna Carta of 1215 CE. It contained clauses on the protection of church rights, limitations on feudal payments, procedures for legal judgment, and safeguards for inheritance. The barons hoped the charter would check the king's ability to act without customary law. John's assent to the charter was not wholehearted. He signed under pressure and with clear reluctance. The Magna Carta did not end the conflict. Very soon after John's agreement, he appealed to the Pope. Innocent III annulled the charter, declaring it invalid. Civil war followed. Some barons invited Prince Louis of France, later Louis VIII, to intervene. The fighting divided the kingdom. Cities and castles changed hands. John's military response was often harsh, yet his position weakened as the war continued. By late 1216 CE, his health and fortunes had declined. He died on October 18, 1216 CE, while campaigning in the east of England. The cause of death was likely a sudden illness, probably dysentery. He was 50 years old, leaving a kingdom in conflict, and a son of 9, Henry III, as his heir. John's contemporary reputation was poor. Chroniclers of the era recorded stories of violence, greed, and treachery. They emphasized his role in alleged scandals, such as the possible murder of Arthur of Brittany, and they noted his disputes with the church and barons. Over time, that reputation hardened into the familiar image of a tyrant. Later medieval writers and many popular histories carried forward this assessment. The story of the Magna Carta also helped to cement his image. When people looked at the charter as a foundational step toward limiting monarchical power, John stood in contrast to that progress. He was seen as the ruler who had forced his subjects to demand limits on royal authority. Modern historians have added nuance to this picture. They recognize that John's rule included administrative developments. His chancery kept records, his exchequer system raised revenue in new ways, and his methods of royal justice expanded central control. These bureaucratic changes helped to shape English government. At the same time, his diplomatic failures, fiscal pressures, and personal choices produced real suffering and instability. The two sides of his reign can be held together: administrative growth on the one hand, and misrule and coercion on the other. That combination explains why judgments about him vary. He could be efficient in detail and ruinous in policy. The long-term effects of John's reign are clear in institutional history. The loss of continental possessions narrowed the focus of the English monarchy. Over time, England became more oriented toward its island possessions and toward building institutions that managed internal affairs. The Magna Carta itself had immediate limitations, but it became a durable symbol. Reissued and modified in later reigns, it contributed to legal principles that restrained arbitrary power. In this way, The crisis of John's reign produced a document that later generations saw as a safeguard against tyranny. John's personal legacy is a mix of administrative strength and unpopular policies. His treatment of nobles and his fiscal demands alienated key groups. His failures in France weakened the dynastic position of his house. Yet his government left records and systems that survivors used. After his death, the regency for Henry III reissued the Magna Carta as part of a process to restore stability. Over time, the Charter's clauses were interpreted and expanded, and its symbolism grew. John himself remained an object of dislike among many chroniclers and later writers. But historians continue to debate the balance of his skills and his faults. This account has followed the arc of John's life from uncertain childhood to contested kingship, through military loss and domestic rebellion, to the sealing of a charter that marked a turning point in English constitutional history. His story tells how personal ambition, fiscal pressure, and military failure combined to produce a crisis. In this way, the record of John Lackland remains a cautionary case in medieval governance. It shows how the actions of a single ruler can create lasting institutional change, even when those actions are remembered as cruel or incompetent. Over time, the immediate anger of his contemporaries became part of a longer conversation about law, rights, and the limits of royal power. For many listeners, the life of John is both a narrative of failure and a chapter in the slow development of the system that governed England afterward. Richard II became king at a young age, and his early years on the throne set the tone for the rest of his life. He was born in 1367 CE, the son of Edward, the Black Prince, and Joan of Kent. His father died in 1376 CE, and when Edward III died the following year in 1377 CE, Richard was the chosen heir. The new king was only 10 years old when he received the crown. A council of nobles and senior clerics governed in his name. They were responsible for decisions of state, while the boy grew and learned the duties expected of a monarch. The regency years were marked by faction and pressure. Different groups at court sought influence over the young king and over the policies of government. His uncles and other powerful noblemen negotiated among themselves for control of royal patronage and resources. One figure of lasting importance was John of Gaunt, the Duke of Lancaster, who played a steady role at court and acted as a stabilizing force for much of Richard's minority. Meanwhile, the country faced external pressures and domestic grievances. The war with France continued in fits and starts. Taxes remained high to support military campaigns. In this way, the early reign combined the ordinary problems of kingship with the extra difficulties that arise when a ruler is still a child. By 1381 CE, discontent among the wider population had reached a head. The peasants' revolt in that year represented an eruption of long-standing social and economic tensions. Rising taxes, especially a new poll tax, had created widespread anger. Local grievances about labor practices and manorial obligations also contributed. The unrest began in Essex and Kent and spread quickly through southeast England. Crowds of men and women marched on towns and royal centers. They presented petitions and set out demands that included relief from oppressive taxes and fairer treatment under local jurisdictions. Richard's response to the revolt was notable for its personal nature. At 14 years old, he rode out to meet the rebels. He spoke with them directly at Mile End and later at Smithfield in London. On those occasions, he showed a willingness to listen and to promise reforms. He granted charters that promised to address some grievances, and he offered pardons to many participants. Those gestures calmed the situation temporarily. Yet the peace did not last. During the events at Smithfield, the mayor of London and other city officials arrested Wat Tyler, one of the rebel leaders. The arrest led to violence, and Wat Tyler was killed. After that turning point, the king and his advisors reasserted royal authority. Promises were withdrawn. The movement fell apart under force, and many rebels were punished. The peasants' revolt left a strong impression on the nation. For Richard, the episode was an early demonstration of the limits of royal power and of the need for careful handling of unrest. As Richard matured, his style of rule became more visible. He began to move away from the constraints of regency and to exercise personal authority. He cultivated a court with distinctive tastes and rituals. His personal circle included favorites who enjoyed large grants and honors. Robert de Vere and Michael de la Pole were among those who rose rapidly in royal favor. In the eyes of many established nobles, these elevations were an affront to traditional hierarchies. Over time, resentment built among magnates who saw their influence diminished. Richard's court also displayed material splendor. He took pleasure in ceremonial display and in patronage of the arts. He invested in palaces, in clothing that marked courtly rank, and in events that demonstrated his kingly status. To some observers, these expenditures appeared excessive. Critics argued that extravagant spending weakened the king's capacity to manage the realm effectively. At the same time, supporters saw a cultured and ceremonially adept monarch who sought to restore dignity to the crown. In this way, opinions about Richard's tastes were already divided. Politically, his reign moved into conflict in the mid-1380s. A group of nobles, later known as the Lords Appellant, challenged the influence of the king's favorites and the king's policies. They accused several of Richard's close associates of misgovernment and corruption. In 1387 CE and 1388 CE, the conflict culminated in open confrontation. The Lords Appellant secured parliamentary and military victories. In the so-called Merciless Parliament of 1388 CE, several of Richard's allies were condemned, and some were executed or exiled. The king's authority was sharply curtailed for a time. He himself had to accept the dominance of the appellants and to endure public humiliation in the process. After this period of constraint, Richard sought to reassert his power. In 1389 CE, he negotiated a settlement and began what is often called his personal rule. Over the next decade, he restored himself to a more active position, but his methods grew more authoritarian. He used royal courts and legal mechanisms to pursue political enemies. He revised grants and confiscated lands. In 1397 CE, he took direct revenge on the leaders of the Lords Appellant. Several were arrested, and some were executed or forced into exile. In the course of these actions, the king expanded his personal prerogatives and reshaped the royal council along lines more favorable to his goals. These moves deepened resentment among sections of the nobility. They felt that customary checks on royal power had been bypassed. In response, many began to view Richard as a dangerous and unpredictable ruler. At the same time, he continued to cultivate an elaborate personal style. His marriage in 1382 CE to Anne of Bohemia and later, in 1396 CE, to Isabella of Valois were parts of his diplomatic and dynastic strategy. The second marriage to a young daughter of the French king served to seal a truce with France, though it did not resolve deeper political disputes. In 1398 CE, a critical dispute developed around exile and inheritance. Henry Bolingbroke, the son of John of Gaunt and a powerful noble, was the king's cousin. When John of Gaunt died in 1399 CE, his estates should have passed to Henry. Yet Henry had earlier been deprived of his inheritance and had been in exile after quarrels at court. While Richard was away in Ireland, he declared Henry an outlaw and confirmed Henry's disinheritance. This decision proved consequential. Henry returned to England to claim his patrimony. He gathered support quickly, drawing on nobles who felt threatened by Richard's recent actions, and on those who expected restitution of rights and lands. Henry's return in 1399 CE unfolded rapidly. The king's authority proved fragile in his absence. Many nobles shifted allegiance. Richard landed back in England, but was soon captured. He was confined and then brought to various locations for imprisonment. Parliamentary action followed. The assembly declared Richard deposed and offered the crown to Henry. The formal transfer of power took place in 1399 CE, and Henry adopted the regnal name Henry IV. Richard was moved to Pontefract Castle and later to Pomfret Castle. His condition in captivity deteriorated. In early 1400 CE, he died while imprisoned. The precise circumstances of his death are debated. Some sources report illness, and others suggest possible foul play. In any case, his end removed him from the stage of power and left Henry IV as the new king. The image of Richard II as a hated monarch developed both during his life and afterward. Contemporary chroniclers recorded episodes of arrogance, cruelty to opponents, and arbitrary rule. Many nobles labeled him an enemy of good governance because of his favoritism and punitive measures. The deposition itself indicated profound dissatisfaction among leading men. For common people, and for later political commentators, his reign became an example of the dangers that follow when a ruler neglects the counsel of peers and prioritizes personal taste and prerogative over established custom. Over time, the negative image was reinforced by cultural and literary treatments. Plays, poems, and histories emphasized scenes of humiliation and excess. Richard's personal manner and his final overthrow fit easily into narratives about capricious kings who provoke resistance. Yet historians in later centuries have suggested a more nuanced picture. They note that some of his policies aimed at strengthening royal administration, and that his cultural patronage contributed to the court's refinement. In addition, his attempts to assert central authority touched on real problems about how the English monarchy should function. Nevertheless, the immediate memory of his reign remained largely critical. He was blamed for alienating key nobles, for costly and ostentatious habits, and for acts of vengeance that suspicions of arbitrariness. His deposition established a precedent in which a deposed monarch was replaced by a successful rival. That outcome had consequences for later politics in England. It made the succession less secure and encouraged factions to press their claims by force. In this way, the fate of Richard II shaped a period of instability that would continue into the next generation. In the long view, Richard's reign is remembered as a complex combination of youthful promise, courtly splendor, political severity, and sudden fall. He ascended as a child and faced immediate pressures. The peasants' revolt tested the authority of the crown and demonstrated the volatility of public unrest. His later style of rule, which mixed personal favoritism with punitive legal measures, alienated established nobles. That tension culminated in his deposition by Henry IV, and in an enduring image of a monarch who had become hated by many of his contemporaries. Historians and readers continue to examine his reign, and they find both actions that damaged the realm and elements that anticipate later developments in royal administration. Over time, the story of Richard II remains a clear lesson in how political choices, personal conduct, and the balance of power between ruler and magnates can produce both sudden change and long-term consequences. Charles VI became king at a young age, and his early years offered a measure of promise. He was born in 1368 CE, the son of Charles V and Joanna of Bourbon. When his father died in 1380 CE, the boy inherited the crown at the age of 11. A formal regency followed, guided by senior members of the royal family. His uncles, the Dukes of Burgundy, Anjou, and Berry, took responsibility for governing while the young king grew. They kept many of the administrative reforms begun by his father and preserved a degree of continuity in royal finances and law. In this way, the foundations of government remained relatively stable during the minority of the new king. When Charles reached his majority, he moved toward personal rule. He married Isabeau of Bavaria in 1385 CE, a union meant to strengthen dynastic ties and provide heirs. In the years that followed, the court displayed ceremonies, diplomatic contacts, and cultural patronage. The new king could preside over councils, confirm appointments, and sign treaties. For a time, his reign looked like a continuation of the steady recovery that France had begun under his father. In this early phase, many observers held a hopeful view of the monarchy and expected Charles to guide the kingdom with care. The first severe interruption came in 1392 CE. During a military expedition in the north, the king experienced a violent mental breakdown. Contemporary accounts describe a sudden attack of confusion and fear during a night outside the town of Le Mans. The king turned on his own companions, fearing that they were enemies in disguise. He wounded several men and showed a loss of direction that alarmed everyone present. After this episode, he was moved back to court for medical attention and care. It became clear to those around him that this was not a passing faint or simple illness. Over time, similar episodes would recur. In 1393 CE, an event at court further revealed the fragility of the king's mind. During a masked ball known later as the Ball of the Burning Men, a fire broke out. The king, who was dressed in a heavy costume, almost suffered serious injury. Several members of the royal household rushed to pull him free. The panic and confusion of that night became a symbol in contemporary memory of a king vulnerable to accident and to overwhelming fright. Such incidents made the king's condition more visible to the nobility and to the wider public. Mental breakdowns returned at irregular intervals. Sometimes, the king could rule without evident difficulty for months or even years. At other times, he lost awareness of his surroundings, spoke incoherently, and became prone to fits of violence or to prolonged withdrawal. In these darker stretches, he could forget names and faces, and he often required familiar attendants to lead him through simple daily tasks. Physicians of the day tried various remedies. Clerics offered prayers and relics. None of these measures brought a lasting cure. Over time, his condition shaped the ways in which power was exercised at court. The pattern of intermittent incapacity had important political consequences. When the king was lucid, he could make law, grant charters, and appoint ministers. When he was unable to act, other figures moved into the vacuum. His wife, Isabeau of Bavaria, became more prominent in public affairs. So too did powerful dukes and princes of the blood, who managed the kingdom's defense and finances. In some years, a council of regency or a coalition of nobles would assume formal powers. Meanwhile, rivalries that might have remained contained under a strong monarch grew sharper. Over time, these divisions hardened into competing factions. The broader context for these domestic tensions was the ongoing war with England, a conflict now understood as part of the prolonged 100 Years' War. The English crown remained a persistent threat, and English armies continued to make raids and to press claims on French territory. French military fortunes varied, and the kingdom needed steady leadership to direct campaigns, to raise taxes, and to maintain alliances. In the absence of consistent royal direction, military strategy became fragmented. Regional leaders often pursued their own aims. This decentralization of military command weakened the kingdom at moments when unity would have mattered most. Personal rivalries among the leading houses deepened into open political struggle. The most important of these conflicts involved the houses of Orleans and Burgundy. The king's younger brother, Louis of Orleans, sought influence at court and acquired substantial support. At the same time, John the Fearless, Duke of Burgundy, emerged as a powerful regional lord with wide connections in the north and east. Each man and his followers vied for offices, pensions, and the king's favor. Because Charles's condition sometimes prevented him from mediating effectively, disputes that might have been resolved by royal authority instead escalated into factional competition. The crisis reached a violent turning point in 1407 CE. Louis of Orleans was murdered in Paris by agents linked to the Burgundian party. The killing stunned the kingdom and provoked an outcry. It removed a central figure from the political stage and made reconciliation more difficult. In the aftermath, supporters of the Orleans family organized under the leadership of Bernard VII, Count of Armagnac, who married into the Orleans circle and became the leading figure of what came to be called the Armagnac faction. In response, the Burgundian party rallied around John the Fearless. These names, Armagnac and Burgundian, would come to stand for the two rival camps that sought to control the institutions of the state and to direct royal policy. The civil strife added to the difficulties of defending the realm. During the periods when the king was incapacitated, rival factions controlled access to royal seals, to the treasury, and to military appointments. Over time, local magnates and urban leaders were drawn into one side or the other. Alliances shifted as interests changed. Meanwhile, the English observed the divisions and sought to exploit them. Their leaders found opportunities to press claims, to make alliances with Burgundian elements, and to achieve battlefield successes when French coordination failed. One of the most decisive English interventions occurred under Henry V. He invaded in strength and won a dramatic victory at Agincourt in 1415 CE. The French losses that followed left the kingdom further weakened. Over the next years, English pressure continued. In 1420 CE, a settlement known as the Treaty of Troyes arranged a marriage between Henry V and Catherine of Valois, a daughter of Charles VI, and declared Henry and his heirs as heirs to the French throne, effectively disinheriting the king's own son, the Dauphin, Charles. The treaty also named Henry as regent of France during the lifetime of Charles VI. This arrangement reflected the military reality of English success and the political reality of French division. It also rested on the fact that the king could not be relied upon to oppose such measures when he was unwell. The treaty marked a low point in the dynasty's fortunes. It altered the line of succession and offered formal recognition to an English claim. At the same time, Charles VI remained king in name. He continued to have moments of lucidity and to issue acts, but his capacity to command was limited. Those who supported the Dauphin resisted the treaty, and the schism between supporters of the English and supporters of the native royal line hardened. Over time, the contest between English-backed authority and French resistance took on the character of a struggle not only of armies, but of legitimacy. Charles VI died in 1422 CE, after more than 4 decades on the throne. In his later years, his periods of incapacity lengthened, and his health declined. His death left a kingdom divided. The English and their Burgundian allies controlled large parts of northern France. The Dauphin, who claimed the title Charles VII, held out in the south with less territory. Over the following decades, the struggle would continue, and the eventual recovery of French sovereignty would owe much to steady leadership in the next generation. For contemporaries and for later commentators, the image of Charles VI became closely tied to dysfunction and to the misfortunes of his reign. Historians have wrestled with explanations for the personal and political failures of this period. Some focus on the king's mental and physical ailments and their direct political consequences. Others emphasize the structural weaknesses of the late medieval French state, the pressures of prolonged war, and the ambitions of powerful magnates. In this way, assessments vary between seeing Charles VI as the central cause of disaster and seeing him as a figure whose misfortunes intersected with broader trends that would have tested any ruler. Modern medical historians have proposed hypotheses about the nature of his illness, suggesting possibilities such as trauma-related psychosis or other disorders known today. Those suggestions remain cautious because contemporary sources are limited and medical understanding of the past is necessarily provisional. The reputation of Charles VI as a disastrous king took shape during his life and grew afterward. Contemporaries blamed incapacity for allowing faction to flourish and for permitting English advances. Chroniclers recorded episodes of violence at court, the murder of princes, and the humiliation of the realm. Over time, these narratives reinforced an image of a monarchy that had failed to protect the unity of the kingdom. Yet some historians also point to the efforts made by those around the king to govern responsibly when he could not. Regents, councils, and municipal leaders at times preserved institutions and prevented total collapse. In this way, the story is mixed. The monarchy suffered severe setbacks, but it did not disappear. In the long view, Charles VI's reign teaches about the fragility of authority when personal illness intersects with structural stress. The king's early promise, his capacity for cultured rule, and his periodic competence are part of the record. So too are the disorders that left him unable to perform continuously, and the dynastic struggles that followed. The 100 Years' War provided the backdrop, and the internecine conflict between Burgundian and Armagnac forces provided a proximate cause of political paralysis. Together, these factors produced a period of hardship for France, marked by invasion, civil war, and a disputed succession. As a final point, it is useful to note how later generations used the memory of this reign. Writers and political actors held up the failures of the time as warnings about the dangers of divided counsel and weak leadership. At the same time, the recovery that followed in later decades suggested that institutions and local authorities could adapt and respond. In the end, Charles VI's life and reign remain a study in how the personal health of a ruler, the ambitions of great nobles, and the pressures of long war can combine to shape the fate of a nation. The record is clear about the miseries that accompanied his rule, and it is also clear that the path from crisis to recovery required efforts by many people beyond the king himself. Philip IV of France, called Philip the Fair, was a man of clear aims and determined methods. He was born in 1268 CE, the son of Philip III and of Isabella of Aragon. His marriage in 1284 CE to Joan of Navarre brought him additional titles and territories, including the Kingdom of Navarre and the County of Champagne. He became King of France in 1285 CE when his father died, and he set out to strengthen royal authority, to centralize administration, and to secure the finances of the crown. From early in his reign, he showed a willingness to use law and procedure to pursue political ends. Over time, these tools became the instruments by which he exercised power. Philip's government relied increasingly on trained officials and on written records. He promoted royal courts that could hear cases and decide disputes, and he increased the reach of royal officers in the provinces. In this way, he built a more uniform administration than had been typical under earlier kings. He also pursued a systematic policy of revenue extraction. Military obligations, diplomatic demands, and the maintenance of a royal household required money. When traditional sources proved insufficient, Philip looked for new means of raising funds. He introduced special levies, imposed fines, and extracted loans from wealthy groups. The methods had a purpose. They helped sustain the state he was building. They also provoked resistance and damaged his reputation among many contemporaries. One important target of his fiscal policy was the church. Philip claimed that the clergy of France should contribute to the costs of the realm in the same way as other subjects. He asked for money and expected cooperation. The Pope resisted. In 1296, CE Pope Boniface VIII issued the bull Claricis Lacos, which forbade the taxation of clergy without papal consent. Philip responded by restricting the export of money from France and by threatening penalties for those who supported the papal position. The dispute hardened political lines. Philip sought allies within the kingdom by summoning representatives of the estates of the realm. In 1302 CE, he called the first assembly that is commonly described as an estates general, bringing together clergy, nobility, and townsmen to present a united front. The meeting provided Philip with public backing, and it also signaled a new level of direct royal involvement in public opinion. Relations between the crown and the papacy worsened further. In 1302 CE, Pope Boniface VIII issued the bull Unum Sanctam, which affirmed the supremacy of the papacy in spiritual and temporal matters. The bull provoked sharp responses in France. Philip regarded such claims as a challenge to his authority. He refused to be subordinated in political matters that affected the governance of his realm. The conflict turned personal and acrimonious. Philip relied on legal accusations and on agents who could put pressure on the Pope's supporters. One of his most trusted operatives was Guillaume de Nogaret, a lawyer and royal counselor who carried out missions on the king's behalf. The confrontation reached a crisis in 1303 CE at the papal residence in Anagni. With the support of a disaffected noble, Nogaret led a small force and confronted Pope Boniface VIII. The Pope was seized and humiliated in what became known as the Anagni Incident. Contemporary accounts recorded the violence and the indignity. The Pope was soon released, but he died shortly thereafter in 1303 CE. The event left a stain on relations between France and the Curia. It also helped to shift the balance of power. In 1305 CE, the cardinals elected Bertrand de Got, a Frenchman, as pope. He took the name Clement V and was sympathetic to the demands of the French crown. In the years that followed, he moved the papal court to Avignon in 1309 CE. The papacy's location near the French border and its closer association with French interests came to be a lasting consequence of Philip's campaign against papal claims. Philip's use of legal measures reached a particularly decisive episode in his dealings with the Knights Templar. The Templars were a military order established in the 12th century to protect pilgrims and to conduct military operations in the eastern Mediterranean. Over the centuries, they accumulated considerable wealth and property across Europe. Philip regarded them with suspicion. His fiscal needs were pressing. He also distrusted institutions that answered to authorities beyond the king's own control. In the autumn of 1307 CE, he ordered the arrest of the Templars in France. On Friday, the 13th of October, 1307 CE, many members of the order were seized at dawn and taken into custody. The charges that followed were grave. Templars were accused of heresy, of denying Christ, of obscene rites, and of immoral acts. Under interrogation and often under torture, some Templars offered confessions. Others recanted or maintained their innocence. The methods used to secure evidence were harsh, and they included severe physical coercion. Philip presented the proceedings as legal inquiries into crimes committed by the order, and he sought papal approval for action against them. Pope Clement V was cautious at first, but he ultimately yielded to pressure. The Pope convened commissions and issued bulls that allowed for papal inquiries, even as the French king continued to press for a more decisive solution. Philip's motives in the affair combined political and financial aims. The arrests enabled him to seize vast properties and to neutralize a powerful organization that operated beyond royal oversight. They also allowed him to cancel debts that owed money to the Templars and to reallocate income derived from their estates. In this way, he solved some immediate fiscal problems while asserting the primacy of royal jurisdiction inside his realm. The trials dragged on for years. In 1312 CE, at the Council of Vienne, the Pope formally dissolved the Templar order. Some of the leaders, including the Master Jacques de Molay, were executed. Jacques de Molay was burned in 1314 CE after a summary condemnation in Paris. The dissolution of the order removed a major international institution and redistributed its wealth and responsibilities across secular and ecclesiastical authorities. These events contributed to a wider perception of Philip as ruthless and manipulative. He had used royal courts and legal instruments to bring down an order that many saw as a pillar of Christendom. He had orchestrated the humiliation of a pope and had forced the papacy to relocate. He had engaged in measures that appeared arbitrary to observers. His critics emphasized the severity of his methods. Chroniclers, clerics, and lay commentators recorded episodes of detention, interrogation, and confiscation, and they often judged the king harshly. His fiscal policies affected other groups as well. In 1306, CE Philip expelled the Jews from the royal domains and seized their assets. The expulsion was presented as a measure against usury and exploitation, and it also served immediate financial ends. After some years, practical considerations led to a partial reversal and to the readmission of some Jewish communities under regulated conditions. But the expulsion itself was decisive in shaping popular memory of the king. Merchants, moneylenders, and bankers suffered pressures that undermined confidence in the security of property. These measures reinforced the image of a monarch who would subordinate legal protections to fiscal and political objectives. Contemporaries responded in mixed ways. Some nobles and townsmen profited from royal patronage and found security under a stronger central government. Others resented the loss of local autonomy and the use of royal power to impose penalties and to seize property. Many clerics were alienated by Philip's assaults on papal authority and by his demands for money. The Pope's supporters condemned the king as a usurper of spiritual prerogatives, while royal partisans praised him for defending the interests of the realm. In this way, his policies produced both consolidation of state power and deep resentments. His personal image was also conflicted. The epithet "the Fair" referred to his appearance and to a public persona that suggested elegance and dignity. Yet many writers and subjects called him by different names. Some used the cold king or described him as hard and unfeeling. That contrast illuminates how political style and personal reputation could diverge. To allies, he appeared efficient and resolute. To opponents, he appeared calculating and remorseless. Over time, the harsher judgments carried weight in popular memory, and they influenced later interpretations of his reign. Philip's diplomatic and military record was not free of setbacks. His wars in Flanders culminated in a notable defeat at the Battle of the Golden Spurs in 1302 CE. when French forces suffered a shocking loss in the field. That defeat complicated his northern policy and underscored the limits of royal military power when local forces were determined. He responded by rebuilding and reasserting authority through negotiation and through continued campaigns, and he ultimately restored much of the crown's influence. Nevertheless, the loss added to the sense that his reign was marked by both assertive governance and significant turbulence. The long-term consequences of his rule were significant. He left a more centralized monarchy, a professional royal administration, and clearer fiscal practices. In this way, he strengthened the structures of state. At the same time, he had damaged relations with the papacy and created lasting resentments among social groups that had suffered confiscation or coercion. The move of the papal court to Avignon in 1309 CE created a new alignment between the French crown and the papacy that would shape European politics for decades. The suppression of the Templars removed an influential transnational institution and redistributed its assets in ways that enhanced secular control over former Templar domains. Philip died in 1314 CE, and he left a tense inheritance to his successors. His sons would rule in turn, but the policies, disputes, and reputations he had forged continued to influence the kingdom. Historical assessments of his reign have been divided. Many historians recognize his administrative skill and his contribution to royal authority. Others stress the moral and legal costs of his methods. They note that his use of torture, his manipulation of legal procedures, and his pressure on the papacy set troubling precedents. In this way, his reign is read both as a phase of state building and as an example of politics conducted by coercion. As a figure in memory, Philip IV remains complex. He achieved many of his aims. He left a stronger crown. Meanwhile, he provoked enduring hostility from those who suffered under his policies. The image of a ruler who could be both efficient and ruthless persisted in chronicles and in popular recollection. Over time, commentators described him as admired by some and despised by others. His life and reign, thus, offer a clear example of how political consolidation, fiscal necessity, and personal determination can combine to shape the institutions of a state, while also producing deep and lasting resentments among contemporaries. Edward II became king in 1307 CE at the age of 23 when his father, Edward I, died. He had grown up during a time of constant campaigning and of strong royal authority. His youth brought a different temperament. He liked close companionship, and he favored certain men above others. Those preferences would shape much of his reign and would help explain why his name became associated with controversy. Early in his rule, he made a favorite into a figure of public importance. Piers Gaveston was a young Gascon knight who had been close to Edward since boyhood. When the new king promoted him and lavished titles and lands on him, many English magnates felt offended. Gaveston spoke freely, and he sometimes mocked members of the noble class. He accepted honors and privileges with a confidence that many interpreted as arrogance. The barons saw him as a rival source of power at court. They believed he gained influence that should have belonged more broadly to established families. Over time, this resentment deepened. The king continued to support Gaveston even as pressure mounted. He gave him the earldom of Cornwall, a title that marked him as a leading royal favorite. Meanwhile, the barons demanded limits. In 1311 CE, a group of magnates forced a set of rules upon the king, known as the ordinances. These measures aimed to restrict royal patronage, to regulate the household, and to curb the influence of royal favorites. The ordinances required the exile of Gaveston. Edward accepted the terms reluctantly and sent his friend away. In this way, the crown tried to reconcile itself with its powerful subjects. Gaveston did not remain quietly in exile. He returned more than once and drew new insults from the barons. Those insults produced a violent response. In 1312 CE, a group of nobles captured Gaveston, held a swift trial, and executed him. The killing of a man so close to the king was a public and shocking breach of royal dignity. Edward was deeply wounded by the loss. He blamed those who had taken part and sought ways to punish them. His reaction added to the turmoil. It also made clear that royal power was now contested inside the realm. The wider problem was that the king did not build broad support. He preferred small circles of trusted men, rather than the more open distribution of power that many barons expected. Over time, that practice eroded his authority. Meanwhile, the kingdom faced external threats that required unified leadership. Scotland was one of those threats. Related events in Scotland shaped Edward's reputation. The Scottish resistance under Robert the Bruce had been persistent, and by the second decade of the 14th century, it was a serious challenge. In 1314 CE, the two kings met in battle near Stirling, at a place later called Bannockburn. The English army was large and confident. The Scots were fewer in number, but they fought with determination under their leader. Over 2 days, the English attack faltered, and the Scottish forces secured a decisive victory. The defeat at Bannockburn was not merely a military setback. It damaged the prestige of the English crown, and it altered political expectations. News of the loss spread quickly. Many magnates, who had already been angry about court policies and the king's favoritism, now saw a ruler who had failed to protect the realm's interests. The defeat invited criticism and gave new energy to rival factions. In this way, a military disaster and political conflict fed on one another. Edward's inability to recover prestige after Bannockburn became a persistent problem. Internal troubles followed. Noble factions continued to quarrel. Some magnates tried to make peace with the king at times, but they did so on terms designed to check royal authority. One powerful figure was Thomas, Earl of Lancaster, who was both the king's cousin and his chief rival. Lancaster led opposition at moments of crisis. He claimed to act in defense of the realm. At other times, he pursued personal advantage. The lines between private grievance and public duty were often blurred. In the early 1320s, another favorite rose to prominence. Hugh Despenser the Younger gained influence and became the primary royal advisor. Despenser's accumulation of land and power upset many nobles. He took control of royal patronage and of local offices. His actions alienated families that had previously been secure in their estates. Resistance took the form of open rebellion. In 1321 CE, a group of lords launched a campaign against the Despensers in Wales and the Marches. The king responded with force, and the conflict escalated into a civil war. Edward moved quickly to restore royal control. In 1322 CE, he confronted the main rebel forces at Boroughbridge. The royal army prevailed. Thomas, Earl of Lancaster, was captured and executed the same year. The effect was immediate. Many rebels were punished, their lands seized, and their influence removed. For a brief period, the king appeared to have reasserted control. Yet the measures taken to achieve this order also fostered bitterness. Executions and confiscations left deep wounds among the magnates. In this way, a temporary victory produced long-term division. That division gave an opening to opponents who would eventually remove the king. Discontent took new shape through alliances and through foreign connections. Among the people who turned against Edward were members of his own family. His queen, Isabella of France, came to see her husband as a danger to the realm and to her own position. She grew estranged from Edward. The arrival of a foreign prince in the royal household and the perceived intrusion of the Despensers widened the gap. Isabella left for France and then returned with political intentions. In 1326 CE, she secured the support of a former ally, Roger Mortimer, a nobleman who had escaped from captivity in England and who now sought to restore his fortunes. Isabella and Mortimer gathered an army in France and crossed to England. Many nobles and local leaders who had suffered under the Despensers joined their cause. Edward and the Despensers found themselves isolated. Over the course of the campaign, the royal position collapsed. Hugh Despenser the Younger was captured and executed, as was his father. The king fled, but he was unable to rally effective resistance. When the army of Isabella and Mortimer reached the royal strongholds, they seized control. Edward was taken into custody. His capture was both a personal humiliation and a decisive political moment. The new rulers arranged for him to be deposed. In January 1327 CE, under pressure, and in a public procedure, Edward renounced the crown in favor of his son, who became Edward III. The deposition was presented as a legal and necessary act to remedy a kingdom misruled. To supporters of the new regime, it restored order. To others, it raised difficult questions about the limits of authority and about the means used to remove a reigning monarch. After his forced abdication, Edward was held in confinement. He was moved between castles and kept away from public life. The removal of a king from power and his reduction to captivity was an unusual and unsettling act. It set a precedent for the use of parliamentary and political processes to remove an untrusted ruler. Meanwhile, those who had supported Isabella and Mortimer took control of government. They governed in the name of the new king, but they exercised power as regents. Over time, popular and elite opinion varied about the legitimacy of what had been done. The circumstances of Edward's death deepened the sense of tragedy and controversy that surrounded his later years. He died in captivity in 1327 CE. Contemporary chroniclers reported that his death was violent. Some accounts described a method intended to leave no visible marks on the body. Later narratives gave more gruesome detail. Modern historians have debated these reports. They note that the sources are sometimes unreliable and that later political motives could shape how events were described. In this way, the precise nature of the king's final hours remains a matter of historical discussion. What is clear is that his end was a bleak and ignominious close to a troubled reign. The king who had been anointed and crowned was removed, imprisoned, and then dead within a few years of his deposition. His death shocked contemporaries, and it left a legacy of questions about justice and legitimacy. In the immediate aftermath, the regency of Isabella and Mortimer sought to consolidate its position. Over time, their power aroused new opposition, including from the young Edward III. In 1330, CE Edward III acted to seize full power for himself and to execute Roger Mortimer. He then restored a measure of royal authority that his father had lost. Long-term consequences followed from Edward II's reign. His reliance on favorites and his failure to build wider support reduced his capacity to govern in a time of military crisis. The defeat at Bannockburn had weakened royal prestige and altered the perception of English strength. Civil conflicts sharpened divisions in the nobility and made peaceful governance harder to achieve. The removal of a king by forced abdication showed that political coalitions could challenge hereditary succession when a ruler lost broad legitimacy. At the same time, the settlement that followed under Edward III moved to reassert monarchical authority and to rebuild institutions. Historians have debated Edward II's motives and abilities. Some emphasize his personal weaknesses, his attachment to intimate companions, and his limited capacity for political compromise. Others point to structural problems that constrained any medieval king: financial strain, the rise of regional magnates, and the pressures of border warfare. In this way, his reign can be read as the product of both personal choices and broader forces. When one reflects quietly on these events, the pattern that emerges is not of simple villainy or of single cause. It is instead a series of decisions and reactions, of favors given and resentment provoked, of battlefield defeat and political retribution, and of a final fall that combined capture, public humiliation, and a disputed, violent end. Over time, the story of Edward II became a lesson about the dangers of concentrated patronage, about the risks of failing to maintain the support of leading subjects, and about the fragile balance between personal loyalty and public duty. It had consequences for the shape of English kingship in the decades that followed, and for how later generations understood the limits of royal power. Emperor Frederick II was a ruler who lived at the center of many conflicts, and his life combined unusual cultural richness with prolonged political struggle. He was born in 1194 CE into a family that linked the German Hohenstaufen dynasty and the Norman Byzantine court of Sicily. From his earliest years, he lived in an island kingdom where Latin, Greek, Arabic, and the local Romance language were in everyday use. That setting shaped him. He grew up surrounded by people of different faiths and backgrounds. Over time, that upbringing influenced how he thought about law, learning, and the duties of government. As a child, he inherited Sicily and the ties that came with it. His mother, Constance, had been the heiress of the Sicilian kingdom, and his father, Henry VI, had been emperor. Henry VI died while the boy was still small, and the country passed through a period of regency and contest. In Sicily, a court culture remained that valued scholars and administrators drawn from a variety of communities. Muslim officials, Greek clerks, Jewish physicians, and Latin legal experts all formed part of the learned world around the young prince. He absorbed that plurality. He also saw the court as a place where careful administration and written law mattered. He later used those lessons when he sought to govern large territories. As a result of his early experience, Frederick developed an interest in languages and in practical knowledge. He read legal texts and learned to negotiate with men of different persuasions. He maintained a household in which scholars were welcome, and he supported the production of law codes that aimed to bring order across diverse provinces. In this way, Sicily became a laboratory for government that mixed Roman, Byzantine, and Islamic practice. Those arrangements also made the kingdom efficient and relatively prosperous. Yet they created unease among some who believed that the island's distinct character should not be imposed elsewhere. That uneasy mixture of tolerance and administrative rigor became a source of tension when Frederick assumed wider responsibilities. He claimed the imperial title for the Holy Roman Empire, and he also held Sicily as a separate realm. His position placed him in repeated collision with the papacy. The popes of his day understood the papal office as a political as well as a spiritual power. They were determined to preserve the independence of the papal states and to limit the influence of any single ruler over central Italy. For his part, Frederick saw the need to secure communications between his German and Italian territories and to assert imperial rights. Their aims often clashed. The rivalry with the popes took several forms. Negotiation and ceremony alternated with quarrel and legal sanction. Sometimes the pope and the emperor tried to settle disputes through formal agreement. At other moments, the conflict became personal. Popes accused Frederick of encroaching on church lands, of appointing men hostile to Rome, and of failing to respect papal authority. He answered with decrees that tightened royal control over administration and over justice. Over time, these mutual accusations hardened into a prolonged political struggle. Church leaders used their own instruments to oppose him. They invoked spiritual censures, and on multiple occasions, they placed him under excommunication. The first major rupture came when the Pope demanded that the emperor fulfill a vow to go on crusade. Frederick made preparations for a crusade, but difficulties in travel and conflict at home delayed his departure. The Pope interpreted such delays as defiance. In 1227 CE, Pope Gregory IX placed Frederick under formal excommunication for failing to keep the vow. That censure excluded him from the sacraments and from public church participation, and it carried political consequences. Many Christian rulers and nobles hesitated to support a leader under such a sentence. Later, Frederick did travel east and conducted what has come to be called the Sixth Crusade in 1228 CE and 1229 CE. He negotiated a diplomatic settlement with the Ayyubid Sultan Al-Kamil that restored Christian control of Jerusalem and other territories for a time without major battle. The outcome was remarkable for its diplomatic quality, and it showed Frederick's capacity for negotiation. Meanwhile, the papal court continued to doubt his motives and his fidelity. Even after the treaty, he did not regain full papal trust. The earlier excommunication had not been fully lifted in a way that reconciled him with all church authorities. Over the following years, the conflicts intensified. Frederick moved to strengthen imperial authority in northern Italy and to limit the power of provincial communes. He issued laws to centralize administration and to make royal justice available across the kingdom. The measures often met with fierce resistance from city governments and from papal allies. Warfare followed. Sometimes his forces gained important victories. At other moments, they were checked by coalitions of Italian cities that received support from the Pope and from other local powers. These campaigns were costly in men and money. They also hardened the animosity between imperial and papal parties. In response to imperial policies, the papacy again used spiritual sanctions. Pope Gregory IX renewed censures on occasions when he judged that Frederick threatened ecclesiastical liberty or papal territory. Later, Pope Innocent IV took a step beyond excommunication. In 1245 CE, a general council convened at Lyon and declared that Frederick should be deposed from the imperial office. That declaration combined religious condemnation with an attempted political solution. It declared that a ruler who persistently persecuted the church could be stripped of his title. For many contemporaries, the act raised profound questions about the limits of spiritual power over temporal rule. For others, it justified resistance to an emperor who had refused to compromise. The repeated use of excommunication had practical effects. It deprived Frederick of normal relations with the clerical establishment. It encouraged rival princes and local leaders to withhold support. It also fed a campaign of denunciation that portrayed him in sharply negative terms. Church preachers and partisan chroniclers depicted Frederick as a ruler who sought to extend imperial power at the expense of Christian liberty. They accused him of arrogance and of cruel methods. Over time, such accusations accumulated and took on powerful symbolic force. Some of the most extreme labels applied to him came from adversaries within the church. They called him a heretic, an enemy of the true faith, and even the Antichrist. That last label had a particular weight in the medieval imagination. To be named Antichrist suggested a ruler whose actions were not only politically wrong, but spiritually catastrophic. Those who used the term did so to rally opposition and to warn their listeners of a moral crisis. The charge reflected a combination of genuine theological anger and calculated political propaganda. It was part of a wider effort to mobilize popular sentiment against a ruler who seemed to many to be overreaching. Frederick's supporters and many later historians contested those descriptions. They argued that he was a ruler intent on establishing legal order and on protecting a diverse society. They pointed to his reforms in Sicily, to the codification of laws known as the Constitutions of Melfi in 1231 CE, and to his patronage of learning. They noted his interest in natural philosophy and in the practical arts of government. In this view, his conflicts with the church were part of a struggle over jurisdiction and were not proof of spiritual corruption. The opposing views tended to harden during his life, and they shaped how different regions remembered him after his death. Military outcomes were mixed during his reign. In some battles, he had important successes. At other times, his campaigns faltered. He could win a field and still fail to secure long-term control over rebellious cities. His efforts to impose direct royal administration in Lombardy met with determined resistance, and city leagues formed to check his power. Those leagues, often supported by papal resources, proved resilient. Even when he achieved a victory, the cost of maintaining control was high. Over time, The pattern of alternating victory and setback contributed to the sense that his rule was costly and unsettled. Diplomacy sometimes produced better results than arms. His negotiations in the East during the Sixth Crusade remain an example of pragmatism. He restored Christian access to holy places without a large-scale military campaign. In Sicily, his legal reforms created a durable administrative framework. Yet in Italy and Germany, his claims to overarching authority met persistent opposition. Local elites, municipal institutions, and the papacy were all able to resist or limit his reach. The repeated breakings of trust between the emperor and the popes made compromise difficult. Each excommunication and each harsh manifesto widened the gulf. The last years of Frederick's life were shaped by these accumulated tensions. After the council at Lyon and the declaration of deposition, he continued to govern in the territories that remained loyal to him. He faced new enemies and a still unstable political scene. His health declined, and in 1250 CE he died at Castel Fiorentino. His death left his realms in disorder. The imperial claim that he represented required a successor who could unite fractious princes and city leaders. In practice, the succession became a long period of contest. The empire entered a phase in which central authority was weakened, and in which local powers grew more independent. Historians have since debated the meaning of his reign. Some emphasize his cultural achievements, the legal codes he left behind, and his interest in fostering knowledge across borders. Others stress the continuous conflict with the papacy and the damage that sustained excommunications and military contests inflicted on political order. Both assessments matter. They show that his life cannot be reduced to a single label. The charges that he was Antichrist or uniquely evil reflected one side of a bitter political argument. The reforms and the institutions he established reflected a different side. When one considers his life quietly, the picture that emerges is one of a ruler formed in a multicultural environment who tried to combine administrative innovation with strong central authority. His methods sometimes succeeded and sometimes failed. They provoked the papacy into repeated spiritual sanctions, which in turn weakened his political position. He won important diplomatic gains at times, yet he could not secure a stable and uncontested imperial order across Germany and northern Italy. The controversy that surrounded him throughout his life and after his death shows how disputes about power, law, and religion could become intensely personal in the Middle Ages. Over the long term, his reign contributed to debates about the proper boundaries between spiritual and temporal authority. Those debates shaped European politics for generations that followed. Charles II of Navarre was born in 1332 CE into a house that linked the Pyrenean kingdom to the great noble families of northern France. His mother, Joan II, had been Queen of Navarre, and his family held lands in Normandy as Counts of Evreux. From his earliest years, he moved between two worlds. He was at once a king in a small, independent realm and a French nobleman with estates and ambitions inside the Kingdom of France. That dual position shaped his choices. It gave him opportunity, and it gave him motive to seek power beyond the borders of Navarre. When he inherited the crown of Navarre in 1349 CE, he took on a title that required careful balancing. The kingdom was small in territory, but important in position. It lay between larger polities and controlled routes across the mountains. Meanwhile, his Norman holdings made him a significant actor within the political landscape of northern France. Over time, he came to view those holdings not as two separate responsibilities, but as parts of a single project. In this way, his aims grew. He sought to increase his influence in Normandy while preserving and strengthening Navarre. His ambitions were not simply local. He wanted to be a decisive figure in the affairs of France and of the neighboring kingdoms. Those ambitions ran against the interests of more powerful rulers. The kings of France saw in the ambitions of a wealthy Norman count a possible threat. At times, the French crown rewarded favorites with lands and offices that Charles II believed should have been available to him. He felt personally injured by such decisions. When the royal court in Paris elevated men who were not of his circle, he grew more determined. Over time, his sense of grievance hardened into a pattern of political aggression. He used his position and resources to form alliances, to buy loyalty, and to act through force when he judged it necessary. The middle of the 14th century offered an environment in which shifting loyalties could bring great advantage. The long war between England and France produced opportunities for those who were willing to change sides. Charles II learned to play that larger rivalry to his own ends. He made agreements and broke them when a bargain no longer served him. He also sought support from foreign courts. At times, he accepted military aid or diplomatic recognition from Edward III of England. At other moments, he returned to negotiation with the French crown. He treated allegiance as a tool rather than as a settled obligation. His readiness to change partners gained him immediate gains, but it also produced enemies. When he conspired with foreign powers, the French court answered with measures of pressure and exclusion. When he betrayed allies in Castile and elsewhere, his conduct left a trail of broken promises. Over time, the reputation that followed him was shaped less by any single act and more by the pattern of repeated reversals. Rulers and chroniclers alike began to speak of his unreliable counsel. The label that attached to him did not come from a single betrayal. It grew from many acts in which he put his own advantage above trust. One clear example came in the mid-1350s. The French king's favorite, a nobleman named Charles de la Cerda, held offices and received attention that angered the Count of Evreux. In 1354 CE, Charles de la Cerda was murdered, and many contemporaries thought that the murder would not have taken place without the involvement or encouragement of Charles II. The killing did not simply remove a rival. It signaled that violence could be a political instrument under his direction. After the murder, he negotiated and shifted alliances, sometimes with the English and sometimes with disaffected French nobles. He profited from the disorder that followed, and he became harder to trust. At the same time, he pursued interests in the Iberian Peninsula. Castile suffered its own dynastic and civil struggles. There he also intervened, offering support to one faction, and then to another when circumstances changed. He made arrangements with Peter I of Castile, sometimes opposed Peter, and at other moments gave aid to Henry II of Castile or to other claimants. His movement between those camps often secured short-term advantage. It also created enmity among the leaders who found themselves betrayed. Some of the Castilian men with whom he dealt later remembered him as a man who kept no consistent policy and who used friendship and family ties when they seemed convenient. To contemporaries, his conduct suggested a lack of scruple. He used marriage connections, promises of military backing, and the sale of offices to build a network of allies. Meanwhile, he cultivated a circle of agents who would carry out secret tasks. That network was a source of power and a source of fear. In courts and markets, the rumor spread that he ordered attacks in dark hours and that he rewarded men who acted without public accountability. Chroniclers recorded complaints about his methods, and they dwelt on stories of treachery. Another element of his reputation concerned cruelty and methods of killing. In the popular memory, and in many chronicles, he became associated with the use of poison. Writers of the time and of subsequent generations attributed to him several cases in which enemies and rivals died under suspicious circumstances. Those accusations were repeated widely and given weight by the fact that poisoning in that age was a feared form of private violence. The opacity of cause made poison an especially plausible explanation for sudden deaths. When a king or a noble had both motive and opportunity, rumors filled the gap left by uncertain evidence. It is important to separate recorded fact from accusation. Royal courts in the 14th century used slander as a political weapon. Chroniclers were often partisan. Yet the persistence of the stories about poison suggests that his methods were seen as notable and as outside the accepted norms of warfare and law. Some contemporaries described him organizing plots and hiring men to carry out secret murders. Others said he arranged the slow removal of enemies through subtler means. Whether every specific charge was true is difficult to establish today. Still, the broad pattern of secret violence entered his public image and hardened it into the epithet that many later writers used. Over the decades, his behavior produced cycles of negotiation, treachery, and revenge. When he broke an agreement, he sometimes made restitution, and at other times doubled down. The kings of France responded by stripping him of offices, by confiscating properties, or by moving against his agents. At moments when the French monarchy was weak, he profited. When the crown grew stronger, he found himself isolated and subject to retribution. The ebb and flow of royal power in Paris and the parallel struggles in Castile and England gave his actions both opportunity and danger. Those who recorded events in his lifetime and soon after placed much emphasis on moral judgment. Chroniclers described his intrigues with disapproval. Clergymen and civic leaders worried about the example set by a king who treated pacts as temporary devices and who used violent means to remove opponents. Over time, these judgments were repeated and amplified. The label by which history has often called him, Charles the Bad, reflects not only particular acts, but also a larger narrative about a ruler who seemed to prefer cunning and personal gain to stable government. His own kingdom, Navarre, felt the consequences. The political instability he fostered in his French domains distracted him from governing the Pyrenean realm more steadily. Navarre required careful attention to law, to relations with neighboring Castile and Aragon, and to the management of local elites. When the king's attention was divided by schemes in Normandy and by shifting alliances abroad, the internal administration of Navarre could suffer. At times, he took measures to secure his authority at home. At other times, his resources and his reputation limited what he could accomplish. The last years of his life were shaped in part by the accumulation of enemies and by the wear of long political conflict. He lived in an age when illness and sudden death were common. Meanwhile, the legends that grew around him multiplied. Chroniclers told of secret networks, of poisonings, and of plots that reached into private households. They also told of betrayals of the highest kind, when a king turned his back on an ally or sold his promises for immediate gain. Those stories helped to fix his image. He died in 1387 CE. The places and the immediate causes of his final illness have been described in different ways by different sources. Some chroniclers emphasized a violent or shameful end, and they made moral claims about the consequences of a life spent in treachery. Others described a more ordinary death from disease or from the failures of old age. With the passage of time, the accounts that stressed horror and retribution tended to be repeated most loudly. In that way, his memory was framed as a cautionary tale. People said that the manner of his end matched the manner of his life. This harsh memory affected how later generations treated his deeds. In France and in Castile, his name became a byword for perfidy. Writers and preachers used his story as an example of what a ruler should not be. Yet other historians have urged a more careful reading. They note that he operated in a deeply unstable world, and that other rulers used similar methods when they faced comparable pressures. They point out that contemporary politics often rewarded quick, ruthless action. In this view, his behavior fits into patterns that were not unique to him, though his personality and decisions made him particularly visible. When one pauses quietly on the record that survives, the picture that emerges is of a ruler with strong, often unchecked ambitions. He wanted to increase his power, and he pursued that aim through diplomacy, marriage, purchase, and violence. He shifted alliances between England, France, and Castile in ways that put his advantage first. He acquired a reputation for cruelty and for the use of poison, a reputation that chroniclers and rivals were eager to magnify. By the end of his life, that reputation had hardened into a lasting judgment. In the long term, his career left mixed effects. He succeeded in enlarging his influence at times and in seizing opportunities that other nobles missed. He also left a trail of broken promises and embittered rivals. The small kingdom he ruled survived his reign, but the political legacy he left was a reminder of the instability that could follow when personal ambition outpaced stable institutions. Over time, the memory of his deeds served as a warning in royal courts and in civic councils. It reminded men and women of the risks borne by realms when trust was repeatedly violated. In this way, the life and actions of Charles II of Navarre continued to shape the stories people told about power, loyalty, and consequence long after his death. Vlad III was born into a turbulent borderland in the early 15th century. Wallachia lay between larger powers, and its princes often had to navigate pressure from the expanding Ottoman state to the south and the Kingdom of Hungary to the north. His father, Vlad II Dracul, belonged to the noble family that led Wallachia and had been accepted into a chivalric order known as the Order of the Dragon. That association made the family notable in regional politics. From childhood, Vlad III lived in a world of shifting loyalties and frequent violence, and his family's fortunes rose and fell with the needs of their neighbors. When he was still young, Vlad III and his younger brother were sent as hostages to the Ottoman court. This practice was common at the time. Princes and important noble families placed sons in foreign courts so that promises of loyalty could be secured. The period Vlad III spent among Ottoman officials shaped his early life. He lived for years in a foreign environment under the supervision of powerful men, and he learned to read the signs of power and danger. Meanwhile, he observed Ottoman institutions and military organization at first hand. Those experiences did not simply teach him facts. They left impressions of the methods rulers used to secure obedience, and they made him understand the realities of imperial force. Over time, his position as a hostage became a central element of his biography. He lived far from his homeland for several years, under conditions that could be strict and sometimes harsh. Sources describe a mixture of schooling, military training, and exposure to the practices of punishment used in the Ottoman world. He witnessed executions and measures of discipline that were meant to control populations and discourage rebellion. When he finally returned to Wallachia, he carried with him memories of those methods and an acute sense of the costs of weakness. Back in Wallachia, the political environment was unstable. The throne changed hands frequently as rival boyar factions fought and as outside powers intervened. Princes were deposed, reinstalled, or killed with some regularity. In this setting, Vlad III sought to claim authority. He faced internal rivals, a restless nobility, and the continuing threat of Ottoman incursion. Gradually, he built the means to take power. He gathered supporters among the lesser nobility and among soldiers who were willing to accept firm control in return for order. He acted through military force and through the selective use of favors and punishments. Once in power, he launched campaigns against both external invaders and domestic opponents. These campaigns had several aims. One aim was to repel Ottoman raids and to discourage further incursions. Another aim was to break the power of conspiratorial boyars who threatened his rule. He moved against border raiders who conducted raids into Wallachian lands, and he also pursued those who sheltered or supplied those raiders. In this way, he sought to secure the roads and to make the countryside safer for taxation and administration. His actions were uncompromising. When he judged that intermediaries or nobles betrayed the public good, he acted against them decisively. The methods he used were notable for their severity. Contemporary reports emphasize practices of corporal and capital punishment that were designed to be public and unmistakable. Impalement became the most famous of those methods. Men and sometimes women were placed on sharpened poles in a way intended to cause death over time. These executions were done in public spaces along roadsides or near fortifications. They were meant to function both as punishment and as a visible warning to those who might contemplate similar crimes or treason. Vlad III also employed other measures of physical punishment and humiliation. He used these measures to disrupt networks of support for rivals and to demonstrate that order would not tolerate banditry, outright rebellion, or deceit among the elite. Observers in his time reacted strongly to these practices. Foreign ambassadors, merchants, and chroniclers wrote about what they saw or what they heard. Accounts came from diverse perspectives. Some were hostile, describing scenes of horror and naming numbers of victims that grew in successive retellings. Others saw the actions as extreme, but also as effective in restoring a degree of stability in a troubled land. For many contemporaries, the scale and intensity of the punishments were hard to accept. Reports spread through Europe and through the Ottoman world, and those reports shaped the growing reputation of Vlad III. It is important to consider how these reports were formed. Sources varied in their distance from events, in their political sympathy, and in their purpose. Some accounts were produced by enemies who had reason to demonize him. Others were written by observers who came from cultures where different norms of punishment prevailed. Over time, stories were retold, with numbers inflated and details amplified. Yet the shape of the portrait they offered remained consistent in one respect. For many witnesses, the ruler of Wallachia seemed to embrace a policy of terror as an instrument of government. That perception explains why his name was attached to the image of mass executions. Where numbers are given, they should be treated with caution. Contemporary chroniclers sometimes placed very large figures on the victims of his campaigns. Later retellings, pamphlets, and writers added to those totals in ways that are difficult to verify. Modern historians try to balance the documentary record against the natural tendency of rumor to grow. They recognize that violence was part of his rule, and that impalement was used on a scale greater than was common in neighboring regions. At the same time, they note that a clear, exact tally of victims is not available. The impression of brutality is well supported. The precise arithmetic is not. The logic behind the brutality can be explained in political terms. Vlad III confronted a dual problem. On one side, he faced the need to resist an empire able to project force across his borders. On the other side, he had to manage a domestic elite capable of overthrowing him if it found him weak. He therefore focused on deterrence. By making punishment highly visible and by administering it without delay, he sought to change the calculations of those who might consider raiding, bargaining with invaders, or supporting rival claimants. In this sense, his policy of terror had an instrumental goal. Whether that goal justifies the means is a moral question that commentators have debated for centuries. Alongside impalement, he engaged in targeted actions against specific groups. He punished corrupt officials, confiscated the lands of nobles he regarded as treacherous, and ordered the execution of men who had committed particular crimes against the state. He also acted aggressively in military encounters. When Ottoman campaigns crossed into Wallachia, he led or commanded forces to meet them. On occasion, he employed tactics aimed at depriving the enemy of resources, including the destruction or removal of supplies that invading armies might use. Such measures were common in border warfare. They were part of a broader effort to make invasion more costly. As these events circulated in writing, the figure of Vlad III acquired a reputation that was at once notorious and striking. Stories emphasized his determination, his promptness in execution, and the spectacle of punishment. Foreign merchants and ambassadors took these reports back to their courts. Over time, the image grew and took on symbolic weight beyond the immediate political needs of 15th century Wallachia. In neighboring lands, he became a cautionary example of severity. In his own land, some remembered the restoration of order. In others, the memory was of cruelty. The later transformation of his image into the figure now known as Dracula is a separate process that happened over many centuries. His family name included the element Dracal, which originally signified membership in the Order of the Dragon. In Romanian usage, the word could be associated with dragon and later with devil. That linguistic path made the surname striking to writers in other languages. Meanwhile, in the centuries after his death, pamphlets and histories repeated his reputation for violence. They circulated across Europe and were often retold with dramatized detail. In the late 19th century, an Irish writer named Bram Stoker published a novel that used the name Dracula as the title and as the name of a fictional nobleman from Eastern Europe. Stoker drew on a variety of materials as he wrote. He used travel accounts, folk tales, and the general European fascination with the East. He was likely aware of the historical reputation of Vlad III, and he borrowed the name Dracula for his fictional count. In this way, a historical figure's family name entered modern popular literature. Stoker's Count Dracula became a symbol of a very different kind of fear, one tied to the ideas of contagion and the uncanny that were common in the Gothic fiction of his time. After the publication of the novel, the association between the historical ruler and the fictional vampire intensified. Filmmakers, novelists, and other artists drew on Stoker's creation and on older stories about the Wallachian prince. Over time, the image of a supernatural figure who drank blood and rose from the grave came to overshadow the concrete facts of 15th century politics for many audiences. Popular culture often removes nuance. It simplifies and magnifies. In this way, a complex historical leader who ruled in a small principality became, for many people around the world, an emblem of a literary monster. Scholars and historians have since worked to separate the historical record from the literary and cinematic layers that followed. They examine original documents, diplomatic correspondence, and local chronicles to reconstruct the political calculations and social conditions of Wallachia in the 15th century. They also study how reputations are made. The case of Vlad III shows how acts taken in a context of extreme pressure can be transformed through retelling into moral exemplars or into mythic figures. The line between history and legend is not sharp. It bends under the weight of language, of politics, and of later cultural use. In Romania, and among scholars of the region, Vlad III remains a contested figure. Some view him as a national defender who stood against Ottoman expansion and who enforced order in a time of chaos. Others regard him as a ruler who relied on excessive cruelty and who committed acts that are impossible to condone. Both readings draw on the same episodes, but interpret them through different moral and political lenses. Over time, public memory has chosen who to highlight: the resolute defender or the ruthless punisher. When one looks back calmly on the record, the basic elements are clear. Vlad III spent formative years as a hostage in the Ottoman world. He returned to seize power in a region marked by constant pressure from outside and by internal factional conflict. He used harsh methods, including mass impalements, as instruments of rule aimed at deterring enemies and punishing treason. Those methods produced a reputation that was spread and amplified by contemporary observers and by later writers. Over the centuries, the name associated with his family entered popular fiction, and it became bound to an invented, supernatural figure in ways that obscured the practical and political reasons behind his actions. The historical Vlad III and the literary Dracula now exist side by side in memory. Each serves different purposes, one to explain a moment of violent statecraft on a precarious frontier, the other to explore themes of fear and the unknown in imaginative fiction. In this steady account, we can hold both facts and interpretations, and we can see how a ruler's life can be recorded, retold, and refashioned for very different audiences across time. Wenceslaus IV was born into a ruling house at a moment when the politics of Central Europe were complex and demanding. He arrived in the world as the son of Charles IV, who had shaped an imperial court and a regional order that depended on strong personal leadership. From his earliest years, Wenceslaus IV lived under the weight of high expectation. He was raised in princely surroundings, educated to rule, and given honors and titles while his father still reigned. Those early privileges and early promotion shaped how contemporaries perceived him later on. When he took on formal power, his position owed much to family arrangements and to the political needs of the moment. Charles IV had his son elected to the imperial dignity before his own death, and in this way, Wenceslaus IV became king of the Romans while still young. He then succeeded to the Bohemian throne on the death of his father in 1378 CE. The speed with which he moved from youth into rulership mattered. He had not grown into the office by gradual stages. Instead, he was placed in roles that required the careful balancing of noble interests, ecclesiastical authorities, imperial princes, and urban communities. That context helps to explain some of the choices he made and the reactions they provoked. Early in his independent rule, Wenceslaus IV cultivated a circle of favorites at court. These men were given offices, grant, and influence beyond the ordinary. They served as close advisors, as intermediaries with other powers, and as the instruments through which Wenceslaus sought to govern. Meanwhile, some established magnates and senior churchmen found themselves displaced or bypassed. Over time, that pattern created resentment. Nobles who expected to share in patronage and jurisdiction saw opportunities taken by newer figures. Clergy who had long exercised local authority found their influence reduced when royal favorites intervened in administrative or judicial affairs. The perception of favoritism was more than a personal complaint. It had political consequences. In a polity where personal ties and reciprocal obligations were central, the sudden concentration of patronage in a narrow group could unsettle existing networks of loyalty. Some nobles responded by seeking new alliances with other magnates, with foreign princes, or with high-ranking church officials. Others withdrew, refusing to cooperate in local administration or military levies. In this way, a pattern of distrust developed between Wenceslaus and a significant portion of his realm's established elite. Religious questions added another layer of tension. Wenceslaus's reign coincided with a period of growing debate about clerical conduct, preaching, and reform. By the late 14th century, the church faced internal criticism and popular calls for change in many parts of Europe. In Bohemia, these currents took distinct shape. Preachers who questioned clerical wealth and who urged moral reform attracted attention in towns and among some of the nobility. The result was a recovering fault line between reformist sentiment in parts of society and the institutional interests of bishops and senior clergy. Wenceslaus responded to religious tensions in ways that sometimes appeared inconsistent. At moments, he showed tolerance toward preachers and reformers, permitting discussion and limiting immediate repression. On other occasions, he sided with church officials and enforced sanctions. Those shifts often reflected immediate political calculations. If Wenceslaus needed the support of bishops and cathedral chapters, he leaned toward ecclesiastical authority. If he sought the loyalty of urban communities or of reform-minded nobles, he signaled some measure of conciliation toward critics of the clergy. This uneven approach produced confusion and anger on both sides. As disputes over preaching, church property, and clerical discipline deepened, incidents of unrest occurred. Towns could see street disturbances. Local courts became arenas for partisan conflict. Nobles sometimes used religious rhetoric to justify political challenges. Meanwhile, bishops and their supporters appealed to higher authorities and to canon law to defend their rights. The combination of popular agitation, elite rivalry, and institutional defense made law and order harder to maintain. In some places, this led to episodes of repression. In others, it led to impasse and prolonged litigation. The relationship between Wenceslaus and the major territorial nobility remained tense throughout his reign. High-ranking lords expected to play a central role in governance, to lead military levies, and to control local courts. Wenceslaus's reliance on a narrower circle and his tendency to negotiate directly with towns and with lesser nobles undercut the traditional intermediaries. Over time, many magnates viewed the king as weak in some respects and arbitrary in others. They complained about his failure to consult, his distribution of offices, and his inability to enforce a consistent policy. Those complaints were not merely private grievances. They became public accusations and the basis for political moves against the crown. Relations with the broader church hierarchy were also strained. Bishops and archbishops guarded ecclesiastical privileges and sources of revenue. They resisted royal encroachment on clerical immunities and on the jurisdiction of church courts. At the same time, the papacy and the larger disputes of Western Christendom affected local alignments. The Great Western Schism that opened in 1378 CE complicated loyalties and raised questions about papal authority. Wenceslaus sometimes hesitated to take clear positions in that larger dispute, a hesitation that disappointed some churchmen and encouraged others. In several instances, church officials appealed to external, even papal, mechanisms to contest royal actions. Those appeals further eroded the smooth functioning of royal government. The combination of unpopular favoritism, religious conflict, and noble discontent produced periodic outbreaks of open resistance. Meetings of nobles could result in formal complaints and in the formation of coalitions opposed to royal policy. Urban elites sometimes sided with magnates, while other towns supported the king because of his protection or because of royal concessions. The result was a fractured political landscape. In such a setting, the king's authority depended heavily on negotiation rather than on uncontested command. Over time, these tensions culminated in a decisive challenge at the imperial level. Princes of the empire found Wenceslaus's conduct and absenteeism in imperial affairs troubling. The electors, who had the power to choose and to depose the king in his capacity as king of the Romans, judged that Wenceslaus was ineffective in defending imperial interests and in maintaining order. In 1400 CE, a majority of electors declared the imperial throne vacant. They elected a rival candidate. The act of deposition was juridical and political. It reflected the sense among important territorial rulers that Wenceslaus could not fulfill the duties expected of an emperor. That loss of status at the imperial level had immediate consequences for Wenceslaus's standing at home. Some of his opponents used the deposition to justify further resistance. In the years that followed, he faced conspiracies and moments when he was seized or otherwise constrained by hostile nobles. On occasion, his person was detained and his freedom limited. Those episodes further undermined the image of royal authority, and they convinced many observers that the king had become a figure whose reign produced disorder rather than cohesion. The final years of his life were marked by decline in power and by a tarnished reputation. Wenceslaus retained the title of King of Bohemia, but his capacity to govern effectively was much diminished. Local magnates exercised greater autonomy. Urban communities managed their affairs with less royal oversight. The church continued to press for respect of its privileges. Popular memory recorded episodes of royal misrule, favoritism, and failure to act decisively when order was required. Historians who have studied Wenceslaus IV offer interpretations that try to balance institutional explanation with personal evaluation. Some emphasize that he inherited a complicated regime built around the strong figure of his father, Charles IV, and that many of the contradictions of the age were structural rather than merely personal. Others focus on Wenceslaus's decisions, his court management, and his inconsistent handling of religious agitation as principal causes of decline. Both approaches have force. In this way, a nuanced view emerges. He was both a product of his time and an agent whose choices exacerbated existing problems. By later generations, Wenceslaus often appeared as a despised monarch. Chroniclers and successors attributed to him the failure to preserve order, to maintain good relations with leading elites, and to protect the dignity of the crown. That reputation was strengthened by the very public acts of deposition, and by the episodes in which his person was constrained by opponents. Over time, popular and elite memory fixed on those failures, and they shaped how later writers discussed his reign. At the same time, it is important to acknowledge the complexity of ruling in a fragmented political world. Wenceslaus confronted a divided society, a church under strain, a network of powerful magnates, and an imperial landscape where princes jealously guarded their autonomy. In this context, even a ruler with different talents might have struggled. Nevertheless, his pattern of favoritism, his uneven policy toward religious reform, and his inability to forge stable alliances are clear parts of the record. In the calm light of historical reflection, Wenceslaus IV's life appears as a sequence of difficult choices made in a difficult setting. He rose quickly from youth to authority. He relied on a close circle of favorites that alienated established elites, and he met the rise of religious criticism with variable and often contradictory responses. Those elements combined to produce tense relations with nobles and with the church. Eventually, his authority was formally revoked at the imperial level, and he spent his remaining years contending with the consequences. His legacy, shaped by deposition and by continuing unrest, remained as a cautionary example of what can happen when personal rule loses the cooperation of those it needs to govern. Over time, historians have returned to his reign to untangle context from choice. But the basic story of an unpopular monarch who struggled to hold a divided realm remains central to his place in history. We have looked at rulers whose deeds and decisions made them widely disliked in their own time. Some of those kings, such as Wenceslaus IV, rose to power quickly and faced tangled problems inherited from predecessors like Charles IV. In some cases, structural pressures mattered most. In other cases, personal choices and the management of court, church, and nobles amplified disorder. Over time, reputations hardened through deposition, chroniclers' accounts, and popular memory. Still, the stories teach a steady lesson. Authority depends on the cooperation of many parties. Clear rules and consistent action matter. Above all, context shapes outcome as much as character. Reflecting on the past helps us see how fragile political order can be and how easily trust can be lost. Now close your eyes and breathe slowly. Let the facts rest and let the day settle. Good rest.